Today's shiur begins the second line from the top of Daf Yud at the Mishnah. Omar, a person says, Omra Porazu, this cow said. Now we have what appears to be a talking cow. Hareini Nazira im oimedes ani. I will be a Nazira, I will be a Nazir if I stand up. Omer Hadeles hazeh. And now we have the talking door. Hareini Nazira im niftachani. I will be a Nazir if I open up. Beishamai omrim Nazir. Beishamai says the Nazir's vow takes hold. Ubeisilo omrim eino Nazir. And Beisilo says it does not take hold. Omar Rebbe Yehuda. Af kishomru Beishamai. Even when Beishamai refers to something that takes hold, lo omru elo ba'omer harei porozu olai korban im oimedes ad ani. The Rashi explains, Omar Rabbi Yehuda, lo omru Beishamai shihei nazir klal. Beishamai never says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Beishamai never said that there would be nazirus. Shehein lo dibru elo le'inyan neder. Beishamai spoke only in terms of a vow. Shim Omar hareini nazir mibasora v'harei porazu olai korban im oimedes hi me'eleha v'omde me'eleha dehave nodur heimena v'eino nazir. If someone had said that I am a nazir from its flesh, and that this cow is upon me like a sacrifice, if it stands up on its own, and it stood up on its own. In a case like that, then he would be prohibited from benefiting from its meat. But he's not a Nazir. This Mishnah, as you can well imagine, is very difficult to understand on its, we'll say, simple level of reading. First of all, we have a talking cow and a talking door. What could that possibly be? This, of course, is the Gemara's opening question. Pora miko mishtaya. Does a cow speak? So we have a Mishnah that certainly needs explanation. On the side of the Gemara, we have a nosei mivneh heading. Nosei, the topic heading, mivneh structural note. And we also indicate that this discussion will go ad soif amid beis. We have we'll say a pretty long discussion ahead of us. Basically, it's one topic till the end of today's shiur. The diamonds are nisyonos lahasbir hadikotoni b'masnisin, attempts to explain that which it says in the Mishnah, Omar Omra Porazu Hareini Nazira im oimedes ani. To explain this story of someone telling us about a cow that says, I will be a Nazir if I stand up. So just to get a bird's eye view of the Gemara, you notice that we have a number 1 with a diamond. That's Rami Bar Chama's approach. Several lines from the bottom, Rava, and he's noted as 2, and we see an Aleph and a Beis. So we have 2 stages in appreciating what Rava says till that point. And then when you get to Omid Beis, you'll see a Gimel. That would be a 3rd stage in finally presenting the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Omar Rami Bar Chama. Hocha b'mayaskinon. Here in the Mishnah, what are we talking about? Kegon shahoisa pora revutza lefanov. We have a person standing in front of a cow that's revutza. Revutza means it's in a lying position, or it's a crouched lying position. The Omar. And the fellow says, the person says, Kisvura porazu eino oimedes. This cow gives us the impression that it's not going to stand up. Hareini nazir mi basara im omdo me'eleha. I am a nazir from its flesh, if it stands up on its own. The omdo me'eleha. And lo and behold, the animal stood up on its own. V'holchu beishamai l'shitasan u'beishilo l'shitasan. Using this as our foundation, that the Mishnah is a man who said, Hareini Nazir mi Besora im Omda Meleh. we will then discover that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel rule what they rule. We saw in the Mishnah Beis Shammai saying there is a Nazir, he becomes a Nazir, and Beis Hillel says he does not become a Nazir. This is a reflection of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel being consistent with what we learned in our previous shiur. They are consistent with their opinions. Beis Shammai, the Amri, Minad Grogros, Minad Velo Havi Nazir. We saw on Daf Tes, where a person had said, Hareini Nazir Minad Grogros Minad Velo. Beis Shammai ruled he is a Nazir. So even though you have a person declaring Nazirus and then stating abstention from figs, Grogros and figs in different forms of preparation. For our purposes, Grogros and Veil are a reference to figs. Of course, figs have nothing to do with actual Torah Nazirus. Nazirus is abstention from wine with other halachas that accompany it. And yet Beis Shammai says that if a person says, Hareini Nazir min ha-Grogros min ha-Veilo, he becomes a Nazir, Hachanami ki omar mi basara. Here too, when he says, Hareini Nazir mi basara, I'm accepting Nazirus from its flesh. Have a Nazir. But he becomes a Nazir. We look at the, we'll say, at the opening phrase of this individual. We saw in our previous year the concept of Tfos Lashon Rishon. We focus on the opening part of his phrase, comment. Beis Hillel omrim lo havi Nazir. And Beis Hillel, again, consistent with the case of the Mishnah Daf Tes, Hareini Nazir mi ha-Grogros min ha-Veilo. Beis Hillel says he's not a Nazir. Likewise over here, expressing Nazirus from flesh, that flesh, meat, has nothing to do with Nazirus. Here we have a very helpful marking, bracketed section. By skipping the brackets, you're able to maintain the logical flow of this sugya. And let's skip it initially just to get into we'll say the feel of the flow. Omar Rava. Rava, hearing Rami Bar Chama's explanation, specifically that which we dashed underlined, and we have an arrow, again, you see an arrow to the right hand side of the Gemara text. Rava says, Mi Kotani, does it say in the Mishnah, Im Omdo Me'eleha? The Nazirus, according to Rami Bar Chama, was contingent upon the animal standing up on its own, without him having to exert without the person or the owner exerting any effort. If it stood up on its own, then the Nazirus kicks in, according to Beis Shammai. So the idea of it standing up on its own is very central to the Nazirus. And that's what Rami Bar Chama said that the Mishnah is talking about. But does it say that in the Mishnah? So Rava's objection to Rami Bar Chama is a textual type objection, where Rava here says, Mi Kotani Yomdo Me'alel. Does it say that? Elo Omar Rava. And then Rava goes on with his presentation, his explanation of the Mishnah. What were the circumstances? Before, of course, we get to that, we go back to the bracketed section. We have a note on the side where the starred note appears halfway down the page, the Gemara section of the page. In the margin we wrote, Achrei Sagraim Rava Yaksha al Pirushu Shirami Bar Chama ala Mishnah. After the brackets, as we already saw, Rava raises his objection to Rami Bar Chama's explanation of the Mishnah. Besocha Sagraim Gemara Sholis. Within the brackets, the Gemara will ask, Lefi HaHesper Shel Rami Bar Chama Din Zek Kvar Shnui Bavar. According to Rami Bar Chama's explanation, where he had said, Hareini Nazir mi Besori Momdo Me'aleo, and Beis Shammai is L'shitasam, and Beis Hillel is L'shitasam, where each one is in effect repeating here in this Mishnah Daf Yud what they already said in the Mishnah Daf Tes. Zek Kvar Shnei Bavar. We already learned this in Kain. Lama Tzrichi Oi Dugma. Why then do we need another example of essentially the same thing? That's the Gemara's question. So we turn now to the bracketed section, and we have also a structural note on the side, the other side of the Gemara, the other margin, the double underline that you see there is Hadgoshas Hadugmois L'Shem Hatzrichusa Shemuzbar B'Gemara, highlighting the different cases and justifying why we need each one of them to be taught. So if you scan ahead within the bracketed section of Gemara, you see what's double underlined. All these cases, Grogos Devela from Daf Tes, Bosar from our Mishnah, and also Deles is double underlined, the case of the door. Now the Gemara, within the brackets. The Amruha Beis Shammai Chada Zimna, according to Rami Bar Chamo's explanation, that we're talking about a person who said Hareini Nazir mi Besara. Is that not already something that Beis Shammai taught in the previous Mishnah, where he said Hareini Nazir min Agrogros? Omar Rava Tarti Tlas. Rava says that we need all of these examples. These two examples of Para and Delis, and the third example, Grogos from the Mishnah before. V'chein Toni Rabbi Chia Tarti Tlas, and Rabbi Chia, who authored Brises, he also has in his Brises these three examples. V'chein Omer Rabbi Shaya Tarti Tlas, and Rabbi Shaya also says there are 2-3 examples. In other words, these Mishnayos are very accurate, and the repeated cases, each one is necessary, utsrichi, and each one is necessary. And here we have the point. The Yitmar Baha Grogros Udvela, had we had the opinion of Beis Shammai presented with regard to Grogros and Vela, that he becomes a Nazir, even though he said he's going to be a Nazir from Grogros and the Vela, Hasamhu Diamri Beis Shammai having Nazir there, Beis Shammai says he becomes a Nazir mishum de michlefon ba'anovim. They're all fruits. Michlefon means they get confused with grapes. So if a person would say he's a Nazir from grapes, he certainly would become a Nazir, because grapes are what the Torah bans for a Nazir. So as to preempt any confusion, we insist on any fruit reference. He becomes a Nazir. Because if you would say, for example, that a person who says, I'm a Nazir from Grogos and Geveli doesn't become a Nazir, he might think the same thing by grapes. He wouldn't become a Nazir, and that would be a major error. Avol basar be'anovim lo michlaf. But had I not had our Mishnah here on Daf Yud, I would have said that people don't confuse meat with grapes. And therefore, without this Mishnah, I would have been led to think that a person who says Hareini Nazir min basar does not become a Nazir whatsoever. The Itmar basar, and I had our Mishnah that says that when one says Hareini Nazir min basar, he becomes a Nazir. I would have thought that only here he becomes a Nazir. Have a Nazir b'bisra v'chamra. It's customary for people to eat meat together with wine. So wine and meat go together. Avol grogros udveilolo. But had I not been taught the case of Hareini Nazir Daf Tes, the mission from Daf Tes, Hareini Nazir min grogros min adveila, I would have thought that does not bind him to Nazirus. Komash Malon. Therefore, I need to tell you, in addition to our Mishnah of Hareini Nazir mi Bisara, that he becomes a Nazir, if he says Hareini Nazir min Agros min Adveli, also becomes a Nazir. Just by stating the Bosar case, I wouldn't have known that the Grogos also would lead to Nazirus. Therefore, it has to be stated. V'yitmar hani tarti, and had we had just these two examples, namely the fig example and the meat example, hani hu dekarmi Beis Shammai. It's in these cases that Beis Shammai says he becomes a Nazir. And they're both in the realm of things you eat, and we gave explanations for each one. Avol deles emo modu lahula Beis Hillel. But the case of the door, had it not been stated, I would have thought that there Beis Shammai would concede to Beis Hillel that he's not a Nazir. V'itana deles, and had we had the case of deles, b'hal kamri Beis Hillel. Here Beis Hillel says he does not become a Nazir. Would I have known Beis Hillel's position regarding the other two examples? Avol bahach tarti, the other two examples, the fig example and the meat example. Emo modu lahu leBeis Shammai. I might have thought that Beis Hillel concedes to Beis Shammai that he does become a Nazir. Komash malon delo. Therefore, I need to teach the other cases as well for the sake of Beis Hillel, to tell me that they do not concede to Beis Shammai, and that even in the cases of Hareini Nazir min Basara or Hareini Nazir min Grogros min Advela, Beis Hillel says he does not become a Nazir. Now, we continue with the Gemara with Rava. Omar Rava. Rava here challenges Rami Bar Chama's explanation of the Mishnah. Use the arrows. Mi kotani. Does it say in our Mishnah, like you, Rami Bar Chama, said, Im omdo me'elel, that I'm accepting Nazirus if it stands up, if the cow stands up on its own? That's a central point to the acceptance of the Nazirus. As far as Rami Bar Chama is concerned, you would expect that to appear in the Mishnah if that were its explanation. Elo Omar Rava. So Rava now presents his version of the Mishnah. What's going on? There was a cow lying on the ground. V'omar Harei Olai Korban. And he said that this cow is upon me a korban. It could mean that it's upon me to be forbidden. That's how the Rashi seems to learn, that he is Mazir Atzmo. Mazir Atzmo means he is removing himself from benefiting from the meat. So he says, upon seeing this cow lying on the floor, he says, it is upon me like a sacrifice, if it stands up. Tosfos points out that for a complete understanding of Rava, we really have to wait for the development of Rava's opinion later in the Gemara. The Gemara interrupts with a question before Rava really has a chance to develop his point. So, with that in mind, we continue in the Gemara. Bishlama Pora Bas Korban Hi. If we take Rava's statement literally, that he is dedicating the cow as a korban. In other words, he uses the term korban with regard to the cow. That is appropriate when you're dealing with a cow. Ela deles bas korban, but a door. Can you speak about a door being a korban? The term korban would have no relevance to a door. So we have to offer a new, let's say, more accurate explanation for Rava. Elo Omar Rava. Kegoin shoy saporo revut solofonov. Same opening. There is a cow lying in front of him. We continue at the top of Omid Beis. The Omar, and the person says, Hareini Nazir miyayin imlo omda. I am going to be a Nazir from wine, meaning I'm going to accept Nazirus if it does not stand up. So he'll be a Nazir if it remains lying there. The omda me'eleha, and the animal stood up on its own. According to Beis Shammai, in the Mishnah, the man, the speaker, becomes a Nazir. Beis Shammai Savri. Turfei Dahai Gavra. Beis Shammai holds that the main intention of this man, when he said, I'll be a Nazir if it doesn't stand up, the main intention of this person was Mishum Ukma Biyodehu. It was because fear or his concern with having to pick the animal up on his own by himself. In other words, he has to, the person's exertion of energy to pick up the animal. Meaning, the person was in effect saying, I'll be a Nazir if I don't have to pick up the animal. V'halo ukma. And in reality, he did not pick up the animal. The animal stood up on its own. Therefore, he becomes a Nazir. And that's what Beis Shammai had said. Beis Hillel Savri, and Beis Hillel in contrast holds, Turfei Dahai Gavra, mishum deraviahu. The main intention of this person with regard to his Nazirus, with regard to his accepting Nazirus, was because of the cows lying on the ground. Meaning, I'll be a Nazir if it continues lying there. V'halkamt. But it didn't continue lying there, it got up. Therefore, he's not a Nazir. So at this point, Rava is presenting the Mishnah as someone who is focusing, basically, he's focusing on himself becoming a Nazir. And the machlokes is with regard to the conditions in this fellow's mind for accepting upon himself Nazirus. The Gemara asks, I hachi, if this is so, that we're talking about a person and his own Kabbalas Nazirus. Amos Seifel, continue reading on in the Mishnah, and let's see if we can maintain that explanation. It says in the continuation of the Mishnah, Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Af kishamru beishamai, even when Beishamai says that something takes hold, that there is some restriction, lo omru elo be'omer harei porazu olai korban, where he refers to the animal, he focuses on the animal and says, the animal is upon me as a korban, as a sacrifice. Pora mi ko matvis ba midi. According to Rava's explanation of the Tanakama, that we were referring to the person's, the man's acceptance of Nazirus, I don't understand what Rabbi Yehuda was reacting to. Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah is a reaction to that which he heard on the part of the Tanakama. From Rabbi Yehuda really serves as a reflection as to what the Tanakama must have been speaking about. But according to Rava's explanation up till now, the focus was not on the porah, wasn't on the cow, it wasn't on the meat, it was on the person himself, his own acceptance of Nazirus, his conditional acceptance of Nazirus. So what is Rabbi Yehuda reacting to? Rabbi Yehuda says that Beishamai speaks about a restriction taking hold, but it's only if he speaks in terms of the porah being a korban, which leads us to say, but not in terms of the porah being, let us say, a Nazir. But the focus right now is on, from Rabbi Yehuda, you see that the Tanakama must have been focusing on the porah. And hence these words of the Gemara, of Porah Mikom Matvis Midi, means, according to the Tanakama, according to Rava's explanation, is the speaker committing anything to the meat. The Rosh is our source of explanation. If you look, we have a double star in the Rosh. You can see halfway down the Rosh, Mikom Matvis Midi, Mas Shayach Lomar Badaito Hoyo Shete Oser Hapora Olai Kekorban. Ha lo matvis bomidi elomer beferish hareini Nazir miyayin. Let's continue now in the Gemara. Elo, and here we have the third stage of what Rava was saying. Kegoin the Omar hareini Nazir mi besora im lo omda. Man was standing in front of a crouching cow, and he says, I will be a Nazir from its flesh if it doesn't stand up. V'yomda me'aleha, and it stood up on its own. Beishamai Savri, Beishamai, who said that the man becomes a Nazir, in other words, it takes hold, the Nazirus takes hold, Turfei dahu gavra, the main intention of this person was Mishum ukma biyodehu, that if he would have to stand up the animal through his efforts, so then he would not become a Nazir. V'halo ukma, but he didn't exert efforts in standing it up. Therefore, he does become a Nazir. Ubeis Hillel Savri Turfe de Haigavra Mishum Duruvia V'Hakamt. Beis Hillel holds that the main intention of this person was with regard to a cow that remains lying there. That if this cow remains lying there, then I'll be a Nazir. But it didn't remain lying there. It got up. Even though we just explained it in terms of the person becoming a Nazir, the Lashon, though, was focused, the initial Lashon was focused on the flesh. He said, Hareini Nazir mi Besora im lo omda. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda made his comment that the prohibition or the restriction will have no effect unless he speaks in terms of porozu alai korban. But saying Hareini Nazir mi Besora, according to Rabbi Yehuda, has no meaning. So at this point, with this third level or third stage of explanation, linguistically we've solved the problem as far as the reaction of Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanakama was in fact saying Hareini Nazir mi Besora im lo amda. That was how the Tanakama would present the Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. And you have the focus on the meat, and Rabbi Yehuda says there's not going to be any restriction if that's how you phrase things. Rather, you would have to say Harei Porozu Alai Korban, and even then, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he's not going to be a Nazir. The meat alone will be usher to him. The Tanakama, on the other hand, has his presentation of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, where according to Beis Shammai that said he'll be a Nazir, means if he uses this language of Hareini Nazir mi Besora, he in fact will become a Nazir. Let us now continue with the Gemara. The last point that we made concerned Beis Hillel. That Beis Hillel, who said he's not a Nazir, we said because the person's main intention was concerning the cow remaining lying there. That he'll be a Nazir if the cow remains lying. Well, it didn't remain lying. It stood up. What can we infer, though? That according to Beis Hillel, had the cow remained lying there, so then he would have become a Nazir, according to even Beis Hillel. The Gemara now asks, Beis Hillel savri lo kamt have Nazir? Would Beis Hillel hold such a position that had the cow not stood up, he would become a Nazir? But Beis Hillel has said, mi Besara, namely, Hareini Nazir mi Besara, similar to Hareini Nazir min agrogros min advela, lo have a Nazir. Was that not, in fact, Beis Hillel's position all along? That if the continuation of the Nazirus is with regard to something that has no connection to Nazirus, Beis Hillel said there is no Nazirus. So why, according to this explanation of Beis Hillel, that the reason for his non-Nazirus is because the animal actually stood up, leaving us to think that had it remained lying there, he would become a Nazir? The Gemara answers, this presentation of Beis Hillel is not a reflection of Beis Hillel's own position. L'tamayu de Beis Shammai koamri. Beis Hillel here is a reaction to Beis Shammai, as follows: L'didon, personally, afilu lo kap nami lo havi nazir. Even if the animal would not have stood up, if it would have remained lying there, he would not be a nazir. For our reasons, that if you accept Nazirus and follow it with unrelated examples, so nothing gets started. However, lididchu, according to you, Beis Shammai, the amrisu have nazir, that even though you said Hareini Nazir mi Besora, that enables real Nazirus to take hold, odulan mihas, you should at least concede to us the turfei dadein gavra, that the main intention of this man standing in front of the crouching cow, mishum revia, that he would accept upon himself Nazirus only if it continues lying there. That the whole issue in this fellow's mind, the turfe, the main intention in this guy's mind regarding accepting upon Nazirus, that's only if it would continue lying there. But it stood up. So you should at least say that under these circumstances where the animal stood up, he should not be a Nazir. Oh, Beis Shammai, love. Beis Shammai reacts and says, not so. Turfei dahai gavra mishum ukma biyadehu. The main concern or the main intention of this person was the need for him to exert his own energies to stand up the animal. That if he would have to do that, would then not become a Nazir. Namely, if he'll have to exert energies, then I won't become a Nazir. Did he have to exert energies here? No. V'halo ukma. He didn't have to stand it up. And therefore, he does become a Nazir. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.